Fad diets and why they are bad. Fad diet is a label that people throw around all the time. But what is a fad diet? Nobody ever explains it. We kind of think we know what it is. But today we're going to evaluate and talk about what it really is. Then we're going to talk about why diets fail and what sort of principles do we need to understand when we develop a lifestyle so that we can lose weight and reverse insulin resistance and reverse diabetes or whatever other condition we have going on and achieve and maintain the health that we all like to have. Coming right up. I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you like to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. So I just went on the computer and I've typed Fad Definition, and here's what came up. Fad is something that has an intense and widely shared enthusiasm. People get really excited, they go kind of crazy about it. Second, especially one that is short-lived, meaning people get excited and it's kind of a fly-by-night. It's there and then it's gone and people have no idea why they were excited about it. And number three, it's without basis in the object's qualities. It's a craze, meaning people get so wound up, they get so focused on a promise or whatever they're excited about that they forget to evaluate whether it's a good idea, whether it's safe or sound, could it actually be dangerous. So that's what a fad is. Some synonyms are also things like mania, compulsion, fixation, novelty, that people just kind of lose their mind over something. And then we call it a fad, or in the case of food, we call it a fad diet. So some of the craziest ones, and the list goes on and on and on, but things like the chocolate diet, or the wine diet, or the pickles diet, or cotton balls diet, or baby food diet. I swear I saw cotton balls diet. So then someone suggested that you dip your cotton balls in something and then you eat them, and then the cotton would fill up so that your stomach, so you would feel full. And of course, that's just ridiculously dangerous. I mean, if you have a suicide, if you have a death wish, then go for that. The others, they just fall on their absurdity because of course you could lose a little bit of weight, but it is so far from sustainable, it is so far from nutritious, and it's nothing that anyone could do for more than a couple of days. So we're not even going to go there. But some of the other things that are called fad diets, they're actually more like cleanses. And we're not going to get into detail here, but a cleanse there's a time and a purpose for a cleanse. If you understand why you do it, you don't do a cleanse to lose weight and then go back to doing the things that you did before the cleanse. That's just absurd. You're just going to recreate the problem. But if you do what's called, for example, the lemon cleanse, where you drink lemon juice sweetened with maple syrup, or you just eat grapefruits, or you do just cabbage soup, or you squeeze fresh juice for yourself and you do a juice fast. These are cleanses, and the purpose is not to lose weight, it's to give your body a break from digestion. It's to give your body a break in some shape or form. Now you can do the same thing really with just a fast or a water fast. So there are many different ways of doing a cleanse, but realize it's there for a reason. It's not to lose weight and it's for a limited time. Okay? So we're going to leave those, and then we're going to talk about some of the more common ways that people are trying to lose weight, because I'm just going to assume that for most people, when they go on a diet, it is to lose weight. That's just 99% of people. The ones we're going to look at is calorie restriction as one way to lose weight. We're going to talk about keto and low carb, high fat, and intermittent fasting. We're going to talk about those as a group because they share the common principles that make them effective. Then we're going to talk about the USDA recommendations / the standard American diet. And I know they're not exactly the same, So I'm going to qualify why I put them on the same line here in a little bit. But let's start with calorie restriction. That's been the most common way for the last 100 years or so. People just say, oh, I'm going to eat less and I'm going to lose weight. And then they think that that's the way to go. And this is what the calorie in, calorie out people talk about for the most part. They think that if you can just create a calorie deficit, then you will lose weight, and that's the only way. And they're right in the sense that it is all about calories, that whatever you put in has to get burned. But they miss the big picture. They miss the point that if you restrict calories, your body will slow its metabolism. And then you eat even less, and your body will slow its metabolism even less. So it's a vicious cycle. Let's talk about, does it work? And again, when we say work, does it mean, can you lose weight? And the answer here is yes. Because you can lose weight. Most people can lose weight by eating less of anything. And when they restrict calories, they usually restrict carbohydrates also. Here's the problem. Calorie restriction means you're always eating a little bit less than you would like. That's called deprivation. And if your body then slows its metabolism, so you have to eat even less, and it slows its metabolism and you have to eat even less, then it doesn't work in the long run. So when we say, does it work? That's kind of a big question mark here, because you could lose weight initially, but if it really worked, we would have a lot of skinny people in this country and in the Western world. The point though is you can't sustain it, and therefore it doesn't work. 98% of people who lose weight on a calorie restriction will gain it back because they don't like being hungry. So we'll just say, yes, you can lose weight, but no, it typically always fails, because sooner or later you get caught up. You start eating because you just can't keep it up anymore. Does it address the root cause? What is the root cause of obesity and weight gain? The root cause is called insulin. Insulin is a storage hormone. Insulin makes you hungry because in insulin's attempt at lowering blood sugar, it stores the excess in the cell. And when you're in storage mode, that means you don't have access to the fuel. So if you have all that fuel stored, but you don't have access to it, now you're going to get hungry. So insulin makes you hungry. So does it address the root cause, which is insulin resistance? And the answer is no. And that is the whole problem. That is why it fails. That's why the body lowers its metabolism. That's why you get hungry. That's why you feel deprived, because the root cause is insulin resistance. And unless you do something to address the insulin resistance, then that is not addressing the root cause, and therefore it is also not sustainable. So these kind of all go together, because we can't be deprived. We can suffer for a period of time, but then the body adapts and we suffer more and we suffer more. And then we hit a plateau and then we can't stand it and we start eating and we gain the weight back. So it doesn't really matter if it's technically possible to sustain calorie restriction, because in the end, nobody will do it. And that's why we are so overweight, because yo-yo dieting is exactly that. And the vast majority of people, 96, 98%, fail miserably, and we have the record in hand. Then let's talk about keto, low carb, and intermittent fasting. Does it work in the sense that, can you lose weight on it? That even the skeptics, even the detractors will agree wholeheartedly that yes, absolutely, that keto, low carb is probably the fastest way to lose weight. So does it work? Absolutely yes. And in terms of maintaining the results, we have thousands of people who are finally losing weight and are keeping it off. So Maybe we'd have to wait another 30, 40, 50 years to really see the long-term results, but my vote would be that yes, it is very, very sustainable because it works with the principles of the body. Does keto, low-carb, intermittent fasting address the root cause? Yes. And that is the only reason it works in the long term, because it is the only reason, it's the only thing that addresses the root cause, which is insulin. Insulin is triggered by carbohydrates, by sugar especially, and if we keep eating the sugar, we're going to keep producing insulin, we're going to keep being insulin resistant. The only way long-term to reduce that insulin resistance is to reduce the carbohydrates. And keto does, low carb does it quite a bit, keto does it a little bit more, and fasting does it the most, because during fasting you eat no carbs at all. So the answer is yes, it handles the root cause. Is it sustainable? Yes, because things that are not sustainable is because you don't get satisfied. And fat and protein are very, very satisfying. And that's the first thing that people notice when they go on a diet like that, or a lifestyle, I should say, because they find that eating 3 meals a day of highly satiating food, of food that makes you full, 3 meals is a lot. And before you know it, you probably start cutting back a meal. Some people are just nervous to cut back a meal because they've heard, oh, you have to eat 3 meals a day, you have to eat every few hours. But because it is so satiating, because it is so filling, you end up eating less. And it's only when you're satisfied that it is sustainable. The difference between a diet and a lifestyle is that the lifestyle is something that you plan to continue. A diet is something you don't plan to continue. And therefore, if you change something for the time being, then it's like implied that you plan to go back to doing the thing that didn't work before you did the diet. So obviously you're going to fail. So diets ultimately always fail. That's why you should never ever do a diet again. Because if you do something temporarily, you plan to go back to doing the thing that didn't work. So just figure out what a lifestyle is that you can sustain and that you can maintain. And it has to be one in the long run that is satisfying, because otherwise you won't be able to sustain it. So next, let's talk about the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture. And some dietitian commented and said that, oh, it's ridiculous. Nobody would ever suggest 60% carbohydrates in the diet, 60% of calories. I don't know where you got those numbers. So let me tell you again, I got those numbers from the USDA recommended guidelines. It's the 2015 edition. They published them on a government website. You can look it up. They'll show the whole thing for you. You can download it. It's a long PDF, lots of detail. And if you read through the different sections and you analyze it, then you'll find exactly what I'm listing here. So on a 2,000 calorie diet, they recommend 3 cups of dairy, and they say that it should be non-fat or 1% fat, because the fat is evil, as we all know. And if you have 3 cups of dairy, 1 cup of dairy has about 14 to 15 grams of sugar. The sugar in milk is called lactose, but it's still a sugar. It's a disaccharide, and it raises blood sugar, and it acts exactly the same way as table sugar does on blood sugar and insulin and so forth. Then they ask you to eat 2 cups of fruit, and some of that can be fruit juice, and you could eat canned fruit or fresh fruit or dried fruit. And if you eat 2 cups of fruit, the average fruit is going to have somewhere around 15 grams of sugar per 100 grams. So 2 cups of fruit is about 500 grams. So I'm counting sort of low here with 60 grams of sugar from the fruit. And yes, it is slightly better than table sugar. because it's not processed. It occurs in the fruit, so you're getting it in a natural form. You're getting it with some fiber, you're getting it with some vitamins. But in the end, the glucose and the sucrose is going to raise blood sugar, and the fructose is going to create insulin resistance in the liver. It doesn't matter in the end where it comes from or what you call it. Yes, there are some that are a little better, but in the end, it still causes insulin spikes and insulin resistance in the liver. Then they suggest you have 6 ounces of grain, and 1 slice of toast is 1 ounce basically. So you should have 6 units equivalent to a slice of toast. And half of that should be whole grain. So that leaves you to eat whatever you like with the other half. So that could be white toast or white flour products of some sort. And each of those will give you about 55 grams of sugar. And they don't call it sugar, they call it carbohydrate, because sugar is when it's reduced down to a single molecule, to a single ring of sugar, or 2 rings of sugar called a disaccharide. But the starch in the grain is just the same sugar molecules linked up in chains. So it's only 10 minutes away from becoming the same kind of sugar that you get from table sugar or glucose. And the impact on blood sugar is exactly the same. It's going to differ a few percent, some points up or down, depending on how the sugar is packaged in the food. But in the end, it all breaks down into sugar and it all creates an insulin response. Then they tell you to have no more than 10% of your total calories from added sugar. So these are things that you either add yourself, like 2 teaspoons of sugar in the coffee, or sugar on your yogurt, or sugar in the yogurt, or sugar in cookies, or soda, etc. And they say you can have up to 50 grams or 10% of your caloric intake. So 2,000 calories, 10% of that is 200 calories. 4 calories per gram of sugar means they think 50 grams of sugar per day is an okay amount in addition to the other sugars you're already consuming. They recommend somewhere around 300 grams of carbohydrate in total. They say you should eat a few cups of vegetables, and if it's leafy greens, that'll give you about 4 or 5 grams of carbohydrate, of sugar, per 100 grams of vegetable, and then you have some potatoes and some starches to total up the balance there. So if we look at this, then if we take the dairy, which is lactose, we take the fruit, which is fructose, sucrose, and glucose in various mixes in that fruit, and we add in the added sugar. So now we're just talking pure sugar. We're talking monosaccharides and disaccharides. That's 155 grams of sugar that they are recommending in the diet. And if you add in the white flour that is devoid of nutrients and is 10 minutes away from becoming these mono and disaccharides, now we're talking 210 grams of sugar. So I understand that the USDA, their recommendations, they include, and they say you should eat some vegetables, and you should have some salmon, and you should have some eggs, and you should have some meat, and so forth, and that the general population eats a whole lot more processed food. They eat a lot more candy and potato chips and Doritos and chemicals. But all in all, it is not that different. It comes, sure, there's a little bit more processed here and there, but in terms of insulin resistance, they're pretty much right on par with the standard American diet. And the main distinction that they make, if you read the fine print in the USDA publication, they say that we think that no more than 10% of calories should be added sugar, and today the general public, the average American, the statistics say that they eat 13%. So whoop-de-doo. they say that most of the problems that we have with obesity and diabetes is because they eat 13% of their calories from sugar instead of 10. So if they just reduce it by 3%, then they should be able to reverse all of these conditions. And there's nothing in these guidelines about insulin resistance or the effect of carbohydrates. The only thing they have against sugar at all, the added sugar, is that it is refined. It doesn't have the nutrients, the vitamins, and the things that come in the fruit and the dairy. So other than the fact that it displaces calories that has more nutrients, they don't see any problem at all with that sugar. So let's look at if it's a good idea, now that we understand a little bit more what it is. So does it work? Can you lose weight on it? So, well, if you combine it with some kind of restriction, then yeah, you could lose weight temporarily. You could lose it for a few weeks or a few months or however long you can keep that up. But if you eat the same proportions to maintain your insulin resistance, then no, you will not lose weight at all. Does it address the root cause? And the root cause being insulin resistance. Can you reverse insulin resistance eating 210 grams of sugar? And again, we're being generous here because the whole grain has about the same impact on insulin as well. The point being, the majority of calories, the majority of food you eat are going to spike insulin. So absolutely no, you are not reversing insulin resistance in the least. If you are pre-diabetic, you will become diabetic, and that is why the statistics are the way they are. They say if we monitor and you become pre-diabetic, you will probably become diabetic within 5 years. That's the official version. And of course that's going to happen if you eat this kind of food and keep spiking that insulin. Is it sustainable? Well, that depends on what is it that you'd like to sustain. Can you keep eating this for the rest of your life? Absolutely. If you would like to maintain and keep growing the epidemic of obesity and diabetes and cardiovascular disease and all of the degenerative conditions that are associated with metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance, then yes, it is sustainable. Does it get any results you want? No. So we'll put a yes with a question mark because absolutely, you could do it. It's not going to get what you want. So now that we understand some of the principles to look for, then let's talk about what fad diets are and why they're bad. So is calorie restriction a fad diet? Well, let's start looking here. Is it intensely and widely shared enthusiasm? Well, maybe not. People may not be so enthusiastic, but since most people try this, the majority of people try this every year, there's hundreds of millions of people every year that try this. So I would say that's pretty intense and widely shared enthusiasm or idea of that concept. So we're going to say that it meets criteria number one, especially one that's short-lived. So is that short-lived? Well, we can look at it two ways. How long can you keep it up at a time? And that's not very long. Most people do it for a few weeks. The other way of looking at it is how long have humans historically been applying that principle? So out of human existence being about 250,000 years, calorie restriction has been practiced for probably about 100 years, maybe 150, so a couple of hundred years. So yeah, I would say that's short-lived on both of those accounts. And criteria number three, without basis in the object's qualities. And meaning, do they care? It may not be dangerous per se, but are they getting any results? Are they doing it despite the fact that it never gets them anywhere? So yeah, I would definitely say that they're not really paying attention to the results that they're getting. They just don't know any better. It's like, okay, well, it failed 10 years ago and 9 years ago and 8 years ago, and I yo-yo, and every time I lose 20 pounds, I gain 25 back. So I would say that's without basis in the object's qualities. Let's talk about keto, low carb, high fat, and intermittent fasting. Intense and widely shared enthusiasm. It's not practiced by hundreds of millions. It's not practiced by the majority of the population every year, but it's pretty popular because it's getting fantastic results. So I would probably have to say that there's becoming a widely shared enthusiasm, and I can't really blame people because it's doing what it's supposed to. Is it short-lived? Well, again, don't be confused by how long we have called it a keto diet. That label was invented in the early 1900s when they were treating kids with epilepsy. So the label ketogenic diet is relatively young, but how long have humans actually been in and out of ketosis on a regular basis? Well, any time that there weren't a whole lot of plants or fruits available, grains weren't even invented 100,000 years ago. So they had meat, they had nuts, they had fish, and anything, and if they had food, they could eat that. If they didn't, then they were fasting, and that would put them in ketosis. So even though we call ketosis a new thing, it's a modern concept in the terms of pursuing it, it is something that humans have done for as long as we have been around. So is that short-lived? It's as far from short-lived as you can get. It's the entire human existence that we've done that. So absolutely not number two. And number three, without basis in the object's qualities. It's a craze. Well, this would imply that it would be dangerous, that people would do it because they get some sort of promise, but they don't really care if it's healthy or good for them. And some people might get into it with being so desperate to try something that finally works that they may not care. But when we look at the results, when we see people reducing insulin resistance, getting off metformin, getting off insulin, losing weight, blood sugar going from the 300s to normal 80 or 90, when we see people getting off cholesterol medication, when their seizures go away, when we see people getting off blood pressure medication, when they have fewer heart attacks, then we can't say that that's without basis in the object's qualities. It is getting all the results, not just the weight loss, but it's basically creating not all, but most of the results that people are looking for. There are still other factors. There's still disease processes outside of insulin resistance. There's toxicity and autoimmunity and so forth. But 90+% of diseases are related to insulin resistance. And if you practice keto, low carb, intermittent fasting with whole food, then you are going to get excellent health results. So we have to give it a non-check on number three as well. It looks like calorie restriction is a fad. It looks like keto is not a fad unless you just count the fact that people get excited about it, that it's a fad. So let's look at the USDA, the standard American diet. And I know they're not exactly the same, but the principles are so close, and it's what people have been eating for the most part. And as the government recommended against fat about 30, 40 years ago when they started publishing these guidelines, the rate of obesity and the rate of diabetes went from a fast growth to an exponential growth. It just took off like absolutely crazy, because when people were afraid of fat and they thought anything non-fat was good, they started eating more carbs and more bread and more cookies and more sugar, and the results speak for themselves. Is it a fad? An intense and widely shared enthusiasm. What is most of this? It's sugar and grain. It's comfort food. Are people crazy about that? Is there a lot of processed foods that have these components that people are excited about? You bet. It's a trillion-dollar industry. That's why people have carb addictions and sugar addictions. It's the greatest drug addiction in the history of mankind. I would say that's definitely an intense and widely shared enthusiasm, especially one that's short-lived. So we've been eating processed foods for maybe 100, 150 years. We've had an abundance of processed foods for maybe 50 to 70 years, and we've had an abundance of processed low-fat food for about 35, 40 years. I'd say that's extremely short-lived. So definitely it meets criteria number 2. So let's look at number 3, without basis in the object's qualities. Well, I don't know about you, but it sort of seems crazy for the USDA to publish some guidelines when they see that there's a crisis in obesity and diabetes. They say this is how you're supposed to eat, and then after that it gets worse. And then they do some studies and they find out that, well, more people are actually following the guidelines. According to the surveys, there's a greater percentage that are following the guidelines. There's a greater percentage that are exercising more, and yet the epidemic just keeps going. That looks kind of crazy to me. And if the end result is the current healthcare situation, where we're spending more money than any other country in the world, and we rank last on the health scale, of the quality of life scale of any industrialized nation, then that seems kind of crazy. That seems like they're recommending something without paying any attention to the results that they're getting. So what does this mean? Well, if you're honest about this and you understand what a fad diet is, you understand that keto, low carb, intermittent fasting are not fad diets. You would also have to conclude that the fad diet, that the most popular, the most widely spread, the one that meets the most criteria, except maybe these absolutely ridiculous ones where you're just consuming cotton balls or wine, which I think we can agree we don't need to consider. The USDA, the Standard American Diet, is the worst fad diet we have ever seen. It's been around for a very short time. It has disastrous results, and they keep recommending it even though it has no promise of changing anything. So fad diets are bad because they don't work. Diets are bad, period, because you can never create a long-lasting solution unless you develop a lifestyle that you can sustain. Is there any fad diet that I would recommend? Absolutely not. I don't recommend a diet. I don't recommend a fad diet. I don't recommend calorie restriction. I don't recommend the Standard American Diet or the USDA government guidelines. I recommend you learn as much as you can about how the body actually works, the principles that govern insulin, the principles of whole food and what it does to the body. Learn more. Watch the videos on this channel that talk about brain and cortisol and stress, because all of that participates in the big picture. The only lifestyle that is sustainable is one that is satisfying and that provides the nutrients that your body needs. Those are going to differ for different people. Some people are going to have to do a lot of intermittent fasting to reverse and maintain their insulin resistance. Some people can live on a low to moderate carb level and never develop insulin resistance. And then that's their balance. As long as they stay away from toxic stuff and things they're allergic to, they'll be fine. And that might even be close to what the government is recommending if they're active, if they eat whole food, and if they have never developed insulin resistance in the first place. I don't think I would recommend anyone to go to 300 grams, but they might be able to eat half of that, 150 grams, and be fine. If you have developed insulin resistance, though, if you have obesity or prediabetes or something like that, then you can never go even close to these numbers, probably ever again. So there's a balance that you have to figure out for yourself. Where do you fit on that continuum? So don't let anyone talk you into a fad diet, not even the so-called balanced diet that is promoted by the USDA guidelines. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy this kind of information, make sure that you subscribe and you hit that notification bell so we can keep this information coming your way. And make sure that you share this information and that you check out our enormous library of valuable information on related topics. Everything that you want to know, that you should be able to find a good video on it. And if not, let me know and I'll try to make it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.